In the heart of Rome, beneath the golden light of a fading summer evening in 2004, a boy named Alessandro Moretti walked through cobbled streets that carried centuries of whispers, but to him they carried the weight of a life that had never been kind, for his father, once a respected violin maker, had drowned himself in debt and drink after losing everything in a crooked business deal, and his mother, sweet Isabella, fought to keep their small apartment alive by working endless hours in a bakery. Yet even through hunger and unpaid bills, she would sit at night by the window with Alessandro, telling him that the world was far larger than their pain, that someday he would escape the ruins of their name and create beauty the way his grandfather once carved violins that sang like angels. Alessandro carried those words like fire in his chest, but fire alone cannot fight storms. And when Isabella fell gravely ill with a disease that drained her body faster than doctors could name it, the young man, barely 17, was forced into the cruel rhythm of adulthood, running deliveries, shining shoes, even stealing coins from careless tourists just to pay for medicine that never truly helped, and every night he returned to her bedside, her hand frail, her smile weaker, yet her eyes still burning with faith in him, until one night she pressed into his hands a faded envelope containing a letter she had written years before, a letter meant for him to open only when she was gone, and Alessandro, trembling, swore he would never read it, for reading would mean she had left him, but fate cares little for promises, and weeks later as bells tolled over Trastevere and the bakery shut its doors for good, Isabella breathed her last breath in his arms, whispering "Make them proud" before her silence filled the room forever, and Alessandro's world collapsed into ashes. He buried her in a quiet cemetery where cypress trees swayed against the sky, and with shaking fingers he opened the envelope at last. Inside, her handwriting told him to leave Rome, to go north to Florence where an old friend of the family, Maestro Lorenzo, a retired music teacher, might give him work and guidance, a chance to escape the shadows of debt and shame. And though Alessandro's grief was so deep it nearly swallowed him, that letter became his compass, pushing him onto a train with only a worn suitcase, a violin case he could barely play, and the ghost of a mother's love echoing louder than the train's whistle, carrying him away from Rome toward a city he had never seen but which his mother believed would save him. And as the countryside rolled past, vineyards glowing under the Tuscan sun, hills breathing with olive trees, he closed his eyes and promised her spirit he would not fail, unaware that Florence would break him further before it ever healed him, that love, betrayal, and revenge awaited in alleys older than memory, and that his journey had only just begun. The train screeched into Florence beneath a sky of fading orange, and Alessandro stepped out carrying his small suitcase and the violin case that fell heavier than the grief in his chest, the city rising before him with its domes and bridges glowing in the evening light, the Arno River catching fire beneath the sunset. He had imagined Florence to be a place of promise because his mother's letter had told him so. Yet standing there among strangers who hurried past him without notice, he felt smaller than ever, like a ghost wandering through marble streets that had no memory of him, and with trembling steps he found his way to the address written inside the letter, a small stone house on Via dei Servi, where Maestro Lorenzo, the retired teacher, lived surrounded by dusty shelves of books and fading portraits of students long gone. The old man opened the door with cautious eyes, and when Alessandro spoke Isabella's name, the maestro's expression softened into grief and warmth, for he had once been her companion in youth before life had separated them, and now seeing her son was like staring at time reborn. Lorenzo offered him food, a small bed, and a chance to learn music with discipline rather than desperation, telling him that Florence was a city of dreams but also of shadows, that talent alone could not save a soul unguarded against envy and greed, and Alessandro listened though his heart still beat with sorrow. Days turned into weeks as he swept the maestro's floors, delivered notes to students, and learned to pull from the violin sounds that slowly began to resemble the music his grandfather once created, and though his fingers blistered and his spirit wavered, each night when he looked out at the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore glowing under moonlight, he whispered his mother's words, "Make them proud," and kept going. Yet Florence was not only a city of learning, it was a city where wealth and cruelty walked hand in hand, and Alessandro soon found himself humiliated by the arrogance of rich students who mocked his clothes, his accent, his very existence, their laughter echoing louder than his violin. But instead of breaking, their cruelty lit in him a quiet fire, one that Lorenzo noticed and warned him about, saying revenge is a path paved with broken violins and wasted years. Yet Alessandro remained silent, swallowing the words and sharpening them into determination. Amid all this, he met Elena, a girl with dark hair and eyes bright as glass, the daughter of a bookseller who often passed by the maestro's house carrying volumes of poetry, and though their first conversations were shy and fleeting, there was a gentleness in her that reminded Alessandro of the mother he had lost, a softness that pulled him out of the darkness even if only for moments, and he began to dream not only of survival but of love, of belonging, of one day proving to the city that he was more than the poor boy from Rome, more than the shame of his father's debts. But as autumn deepened, whispers reached his ears that Florence was not welcoming him as warmly as he believed, for behind closed doors certain powerful families had no interest in seeing an outsider rise among their children, and Alessandro, though unaware of the full storm brewing, felt the chill of betrayal creeping near. The kind of betrayal that would test the limits of his heart and transform his grief into something far more dangerous. Florence, with its golden streets and whispering rivers, had begun to open itself to Alessandro, and within this city of art and memory, Elena became the quiet light that softened his wounds, for every evening when her father's bookshop closed, she would walk by Maestro Lorenzo's house carrying a stack of old volumes, and sometimes she stopped to speak with Alessandro about poetry, about music, about the stars above the Arno, her laughter a melody far gentler than any violin he could coax into being. At first their friendship was nothing more than two lonely souls meeting in brief sparks of conversation, but slowly it grew until she began to bring him small gifts, an old notebook for his practice, a pressed flower between its pages, even once a broken quill she said reminded her of him, because though bent, it still had ink enough to write beauty, and Alessandro treasured these tokens as though they were diamonds, hiding them beneath his pillow at night, holding them close as if they might guard him from the voices of mockery that still haunted him from the maestro's wealthier students. For in the daylight, while Elena offered him comfort, those others offered him cruelty, their envy growing sharper each time he improved on the violin, each time Lorenzo praised his progress, and though Alessandro never sought to outshine them, Florence was a city where status mattered more than truth, and a poor boy gaining admiration was seen as an insult to those born into privilege. 1. Among them, Giulio Bianchi, the son of a powerful merchant family, grew particularly venomous, for Giulio himself sought Elena's attention whenever he passed her father's shop, but she, drawn to Alessandro's quiet determination, never looked his way, and what began as silent jealousy soon boiled into plans to humiliate Alessandro at every chance, to twist his every success into shame. The first attempt came at a recital where Maestro Lorenzo had encouraged Alessandro to play before a small audience of patrons, and though Alessandro's hands trembled, Elena sat among the listeners, her gaze steady upon him, and with that strength he played a haunting piece that silenced the room, his violin weeping notes that seemed to carry Isabella's spirit through the air. But before the applause could rise, Giulio and his friends whispered cruel laughter, claiming Alessandro had stolen the melody, that a boy like him could never create such beauty, and though Lorenzo defended his pupil, the seed of doubt was planted among the listeners, staining Alessandro's triumph with suspicion. Later that night, walking Elena home through narrow alleys glowing with lanterns, Alessandro confessed how fragile he felt, how every note he played seemed ready to shatter under the weight of envy, and Elena, stopping beneath the shadow of Ponte Vecchio, placed her hand on his and whispered, "Let them envy Alessandro. For envy is proof that you carry something they do not. Let music be your answer, not their hatred." And in that moment he wished he could freeze time, hold her hand forever, but fate allows no such stillness. In the days that followed, Florence's whispers grew louder, and Giulio, humiliated by Alessandro's resilience and Elena's affection, began plotting darker schemes, ones that stretched beyond mere insult, for envy when left unchecked becomes poison, and Alessandro, though unaware of the depths of malice gathering against him, felt the shift in the air, a quiet storm circling around his fragile bond with Elena, a storm that would soon tear open the first cracks in his new life and drag him toward betrayals far sharper than any mocking word. The winter of Florence arrived with heavy rains that turned its cobblestone streets into mirrors of gray, and for Alessandro those days felt colder than the air itself, for though his music was improving and Maestro Lorenzo began to trust him with teaching small lessons, the whispers of doubt seeded by Giulio had grown into dangerous rumors, spreading from student to patron until Alessandro's name carried the stain of suspicion wherever he walked. One evening when Lorenzo arranged for him to play at a gathering hosted by one of Florence's wealthiest families, Alessandro dressed in his best, though his clothes were patched and old, and carried his violin with trembling pride, hoping this night would be his redemption, but as he lifted the bow to play, disaster struck, for someone had tampered with his strings, loosening them so that when he began the violin screeched horribly, filling the hall with ugly noise, and laughter erupted among the audience, with Giulio's voice the loudest, mocking him as a fraud who could not even tune his own instrument. Alessandro's face burned with shame, his hands shaking so violently he dropped the violin, and though Lorenzo tried to defend him, the damage was done. The patrons whispered that Isabella's son was unworthy, that Florence had no place for such clumsy desperation. Humiliated, Alessandro fled into the night, wandering along the Arno in the rain, his tears hidden by the storm, until Elena found him there, drenched and broken, and she tried to console him, insisting that the strings had been tampered with, that Giulio's cruelty was behind it, but Alessandro, consumed by rage and despair, could barely hear her words, for all he saw was the ghost of his mother, watching him fail from beyond the grave. In that moment something inside him cracked, a darkness rising from the ashes of his grief, whispering that kindness and hard work were not enough in a city ruled by envy, that survival demanded strength sharper than music. Yet even as Elena begged him not to let hatred consume his soul, Giulio's poison worked deeper, for the very next day Maestro Lorenzo, under pressure from the families who funded his lessons, asked Alessandro to step back, to take time away until the rumors faded, his voice heavy with regret but firm with necessity, and though Alessandro understood the old man's position, the rejection pierced him like betrayal. Leaving him alone once again with nothing but rage, a broken violin, and Elena's fading embrace. Florence, which had seemed a city of hope, now revealed itself as a city of masks, where love could not shield him from envy and where betrayal could rise from the very people he trusted most. And in that storm Alessandro took his first step onto a darker path, vowing silently that he would no longer be the boy mocked and pitted, that the day would come when those who laughed would pay in tears, and though his vow was quiet, the city itself seemed to shiver, as if it knew that a story of revenge had just been born. Nights in Florence had grown longer, and Alessandro no longer wandered the streets as the boy who once clutched his violin in trembling hope, but as a shadow drifting through alleys, his mind replaying the laughter, the humiliation, the moment his strings were cut and his spirit broken before the wealthy who now refused even to remember his name. The gentle voice of Elena still tried to reach him, warning him not to lose himself. But even her words began to sound like distant echoes, powerless against the storm of rage building inside him, and though Maestro Lorenzo begged him to focus on music, Alessandro had begun to see clearly that art and talent meant nothing in a city where power and cruelty ruled, and so he decided that if Florence wanted shadows he would become one. His first chance came when Giulio hosted a lavish party at his family's villa, a gathering of Florence's elite meant to show off his wealth and charm. And Alessandro, cloaked in the anonymity of a servant's borrowed clothes, slipped through the gates unnoticed, his eyes burning with silent fury as he watched the same boys who once mocked him now basking in golden halls lit with chandeliers. His violin remained broken in his room, but in his pocket he carried something far sharper, a blade small enough to hide but deadly enough to mark his intent, and as he moved among the guests, serving wine with steady hands, his heart pounded not with fear but with a dark thrill, for he was no longer Alessandro, the orphan, the poor boy mocked by Florence, but something new, something dangerous, something the city had forced him to become. He found Giulio laughing near the balcony, boasting of how he had humiliated the beggar violinist, his words dripping with arrogance, and for a moment Alessandro nearly rushed forward to strike, but he stopped, realizing that vengeance was not in haste but in patience, not in noise but in silence. And instead of blood, he chose a more cunning wound, slipping quietly into Giulio's private study. Alessandro poured wine over a stack of important family documents, setting them ablaze with the flame of a stolen candle, watching as smoke curled and pages turned to ash, the first strike not against Giulio's body but against his pride, his power, his name. When the fire was discovered moments later, chaos erupted in the villa, guests screaming, servants rushing, and Giulio humiliated before his father and Florence's elite, for the scandal of carelessness stained him as deeply as Alessandro's shame once stained the boy himself. Hidden in the shadows of the courtyard, Alessandro watched with a dark satisfaction, his lips trembling with a whisper no one could hear. Now you know how it feels. And though the act had left no blood, it had tasted sweeter than music, for it was the first note in a new symphony, a symphony not of beauty but of vengeance. As he vanished into the rain-drenched night, Alessandro felt a transformation complete. The gentle boy who once dreamed of making his mother proud now buried beneath the weight of betrayal, and in his place walked a shadow with fire in his veins, determined that this was only the beginning, that Florence would one day tremble at the sound of his name, and the screen of fate closed on him standing atop Ponte Vecchio, lightning cracking the sky above, his eyes no longer wet with tears but burning with the fire of revenge.